Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Medical doctors are bound by the ethical requirement to first do no harm. Unfortunately, harm is not something that they can always avoid. Sometimes harm comes about through the actions of doctors, but at other times it comes about because of things they haven't done. David Molyneux is a doctor of medicine who is also working on a doctorate in philosophy, and his PhD thesis is about the difficult ethical questions that arise because of this distinction. Is there a moral difference between doing and allowing harm? But to answer this question, he first needed to get to grips with a prior question. When we allow harm, do we thereby cause that harm? And more generally, do allowings or omissions cause? Okay, so I'm here talking to David Molyneux, so welcome to the podcast.
Yes, hello.
Thanks for coming along. So we're going to talk today about the question, can omissions cause? But that's sort of part of a broader project that you're involved in, right? Which kind of forms your PhD. And I just wondered if you could start off by telling us a little bit about kind of why you came to this question and how this question about causation fits into the sort of broader picture of what you're interested in.
So I'm a GP by training. So in my work as a doctor, I saw lots of situations where harm arose. And sometimes that was harm caused by an event, a doing, and sometimes it was harm that arose because of an allowing. And it struck me as very interesting to see whether those two things are morally the same, whether they carry the same moral responsibility or equally good or equally bad. And so when I had the opportunity to, I then started a PhD with the title, is there a difference between doing harm and allowing harm? That was the basic sort of push for what the work I did in my PhD.
Could you give us an example maybe from the medical context of those two different kinds of
Yeah,
harm?
absolutely. There's lots of examples. The obvious one is the field of euthanasia. So people argue that there's a moral difference between ending somebody's life by, say, a lethal injection, active euthanasia, and ending somebody's life with the same intention, really, by taking a treatment away or not offering a treatment, withholding or withdrawing in the literature. So one is a doing, giving a lethal injection, and one is an allowing, letting somebody end their life by not intervening when you could intervene and save that person's life in a fairly straightforward way. Yeah. So that was one example. Another is a sort of idea about Good Samaritans. So you can harm somebody, leave them by the roadside, maybe to die, or you can drive by, and the outcome is the same. The person ends their life. One the person has caused it, and the other you've allowed it to happen when you could intervene and do something. Now, my interest was, are those morally different or morally the same?
Right, and obviously that's sort of a question that's not just of sort of theoretical interest to people who are engaged in those kinds of decisions.
Yeah,
right? That's something that's really going to matter.
Yeah, they're very different, and in the medical profession, people tend to be much more relaxed about allowing somebody to die, as opposed to sort of ending a life, and then you get into the big debate about the ethics of euthanasia.
Yeah, great, okay. And the specific question we're going to look at today is about causation. So it's about whether omissions, so allowings in your language, can cause outcomes or situations.
That's right. So most people, when they're trying to differentiate between doing harm and allowing harm, accept that both doing harm and allowing harm cause the harm.
Right.
And that seemed wrong to me. It seemed to me that there was a difference in the field of causation, whereas doing harm certainly caused that harm, I thought, whereas allowing harm was a different category. It didn't cause harm in the same way that doing would. And I tried to demonstrate that there was a difference by thinking about what those two things are.
Right, okay. And that's kind of, in a way, I'm not sure it's counterintuitive quite, but at least there are kind of natural ways of talking that tend to imply that omissions can cause harm, right? So if we say, I think you have the example of a gardener who doesn't water a plant and then the plant dies.
Yeah.
We kind of naturally say, the gardener's failure to water the plant caused the plant to die. That seems like a reasonable way of describing it.
Absolutely, yeah. And in medicine, there's lots of examples from medicine too. So if somebody comes into A&E, say, and got a treatable condition, and for some reason you elect not to treat them, then that seems to be allowing the harm. But I wouldn't want to argue that causes the harm, and that's the sort of starting point for my argument.
Okay, great. Oh, let's get into that argument then, if that's okay. So you have actually three kind of main arguments for why, kind of despite potential appearances to the contrary, omissions can't cause harm or any kind of consequence. So could you take us through that?
Absolutely. Well, I've got three arguments and a sort of intuition, and I started from the intuition because that's what sort of motivated doing this piece of work or thinking about it. The first sort of intuition is one that the Australian philosopher Phil Dow talks about a lot, and that's what he calls the intuition of difference. So he says, just looking at allowing harm and doing harm, they don't feel like the same sort of thing. Now, obviously, this isn't a strong argument. It's just a feeling. But there's some plausibility to this feeling. He says, when you look at them, they seem different entities. You can't replace one by the other. And he gives the example of a man who's by the seaside. Somebody's drowning. He can easily save their life by wading into the water, and he doesn't. Well, the swimmer ends up dead, but Dow argues that the person by the seaside does something different if he puts him in the water in the first place versus not intervening if he could. And that's a sort of intuition of difference, which, not a great argument, but it's a starting point that we might be talking about different things when we talk about doing and allowing.
Yeah, so often that's what happens in philosophy, right? You kind of start from a sort of intuition that there's something interesting going on there, and then you try and work out what that thing might be. Yeah. So you kind of take the intuition as sort of prima facie evidence that there is something worth looking at. And then
absolutely.
You try to dig underneath. Yeah. So why did you think? So what do you think might be explaining?
Well, I think there might be three arguments. Now, not everyone will agree with all three arguments, and some people might not agree with any of them. But the starting point is really a theory about causation, which says that causation is a relationship between events. So you push somebody off the cliff, that's one event, the pushing, and then another, the outcome, what's caused, is the falling off the cliff. So it's sort of natural to think about causation in terms of events. Now, I should say straight away that not everybody agrees with that. Some people think, for example, causation is a relationship between facts. Some people think it's a relationship between states of affairs, say. But it seems plausible, and there's a groundswell of opinion that causation is something to do with events. And people like Davidson and Kim would argue that. So going on from that is if causation is something to do with events, then it doesn't seem like omissions, absences, are events. What is there in an absence? When you don't do something, don't water the plants, well, what event is that when it seems to me that there's no event there at all? So that's just a simple argument based on the fact that causation is often thought of as a relationship between events. If you don't buy that, then you won't buy the argument that omissions can't cause. But I think it's fairly plausible to think of causation as a relationship between events, and it's a widely accepted philosophical thought.
Okay, so clearly that's right insofar as there isn't an event in the kinds of case that you're talking about. I mean, quite the opposite. What there is the absence of an event, right? But could we say a bit more about why we should accept this idea that only events can cause? I mean, I think you talk about a few different alternative candidates for the kind of thing that can be a cause. I think you mentioned facts.
Yeah, facts is a sort of big one that's sort of touted as an option. And of course, omissions can be facts. The fact that the gardener didn't water the plants is a fact, whereas the event of not watering the plants isn't an event, I would argue. So if you want to say that facts are the part of the relationship in causation, then you get round that problem that I've just highlighted. However, it seems to me that facts aren't the sort of things that are involved in causation. How can a fact push somebody off the cliff? We tend to think of events as sort of spatio-temporally limited in time and space with a beginning and an end. Well, facts aren't those sorts of properties at all. They're sort of different, and therefore it doesn't seem to me very likely that facts are a suitable candidate for being involved in causation.
Right. So the fact in the example we mentioned before, the fact that the gardener didn't water the plant, that doesn't have, you talked about spatio-temporal, spatio-temporal position or something like that.
That's right. Relationship.
Okay. So the gardener's not having watered the plant is something that kind of obtains in that situation. But the fact that the gardener didn't do so, it's not something that has a particular point in time or point in space, right? And that's
absolutely.
Why it's
and therefore,
confusing.
to my mind, and to many others, it doesn't seem a suitable thing to cause anything. And people say, how can facts push people off cliffs? That they can't. Events can. A pushing event, but not a fact.
And it's weird, isn't it? Because we do. The temptation is to kind of go back to ordinary language descriptions of these kind of situations. So the plant example, where you think, well, would you say the fact that the gardener didn't water the plant caused the plant to die? Well, you probably would say that, but the question is kind of how much can you rely on the sort of ordinary way we talk about these things to actually point at the underlying kind of metaphysical reality.
Yes. I mean, the language issue is a good example you raise, because we say all the time, as we said at the beginning, that omissions cause. The gardener not watering the plants caused the plants to die. But that's just imprecise use of language, I think. Just as you might say, well, every morning the sun rises in the east, and every evening the sun sets in the west. Well, it doesn't, of course. The sun never moves. It's the earth that's moving. But we commonly say that, and people know what it means, and they're happy to accept it. But if you dig down a bit, it's probably not quite right.
Right, good. Okay, we'll perhaps come back to that point about language in a bit. But we've got some more arguments to get through. Okay, so that's argument one, which says that only events can cause. Omissions aren't events, and therefore omissions can't cause, essentially. And then argument two is you call it the push or oomph or biff argument.
Absolutely. So argument two and argument three really need to be taken together. They work much better as a pair. So the argument two, and I'll come to argument three in a moment. Argument two says that if omissions can't cause, because for causation you need what's called production or oomph or push or some kind of transfer of something to cause it to happen. So you throw a stone at the window, throwing the stone causes the window to break, and that's because plausibly the energy, momentum, some kind of quality in the moving stone hits the window, transfers that energy to the window, and the window then shatters.
Right. So is that to say that kind of ultimately all causes are physical causes?
That people who think that would argue, yes, there is. I mean, I don't think it is because of the second bit of my argument. But it's an attractive idea. If you think of causation, it often involves the transfer of something.
Yeah,
I don't think it's a complete story, and I'll explain why in a minute. But for example, if you teach somebody something, you cause them to have knowledge, but it's difficult to see what's been transferred. Well, information's been transferred, but there's no energy or momentum or anything like that transferred. So there are examples you can give. And I don't think argument 2 on its own is a good argument that omissions don't cause. But certainly omissions don't cause in that sort of a way. It's hard to imagine how they possibly could.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's clear that they couldn't because there's no event. Well, so it's different. It's a different argument from the event argument, but there's no physical transfer of energy or anything like that where there hasn't been an event to
That's
cause
right.
it to happen.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
And then you said that leads on to argument 3. So how does that work?
So somebody could reply to this argument that there's no transfer of energy or momentum, no oomph, by saying, well, that's not the only account of causation. So the philosopher Ned Hall will say, yeah, you can get causation by counterfactual methods as well, where there isn't any of this transfer of energy or momentum. And this is the idea that if the event that causes the outcome hadn't have happened, then neither would the outcome.
Okay, so just to kind of give that in an example, so if I pushed you over, if I hadn't pushed you, you wouldn't have fallen over.
Absolutely.
And that's what explains why
my
pushing you caused you to fall over.
Absolutely. And that does much, much better for causation due to omissions, because you could say, had the gardener not forgotten to water the plants or not failed to water the plants, then they wouldn't have died. So it's a nice counterfactual explanation. So you might think, we're home and dry here. We have a way of thinking about causation by omission. But there's a big problem with that, and that problem is the problem of profligate ontologies or profligate omissions. That's the next thing that we've got to be able to talk about.
Right, okay, so profligate ontology, that sounds impressive. So
yeah, it does, yeah. Yeah, so this is the worry that, and this is a particular problem for omissions, that, okay, we accept that had the gardener failed to water the plants, they wouldn't have died. If he'd have come when he's meant to do and hadn't have failed to water them, they would have carried on living. That's the thing. But almost anybody else in the right sort of relationship would also have caused the plants to die if they'd have failed to water them. Right. Because all that we're talking about here is a counterfactual dependence. So if King Charles III had failed to come to water them, they would have lived, and had he failed to water them, they would have died. Had the Pope failed to water them, they would have died. Right. Almost anybody who could be there, conceivably, would be a cause of the plants dying.
Okay, and that's a problem for people who want to defend the idea that the gardener's omission caused the plant to die, because then they're essentially faced with the conclusion that equally King Charles or Pope Francis's failure to water the plants caused them to die.
Also caused just as much. And so we're looking for ways to, and that they're the profligate omissions.
Yeah.
Profligate ontologies. How do you separate out the gardener, who you want to be a cause of the plant dying, from King Charles and Pope Francis, who you certainly don't want to be a cause. That's just crazy to say that, King Charles, in all his busy life, he's not watering this particular plant up in the north of England is a cause. That's just crazy. You want to be able to separate those out.
Right. I mean, I suppose the intuitive answer to that is that it's got to be something to do with, the gardener was supposed to water the plant, and King Charles and Pope Francis weren't supposed to water the plant, so that's why we don't think that they're not doing so caused it to die.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's the sort of way that people have tended to go, to say, well, there's only a few people, and maybe only one person, the gardener, who we really want to say has caused the death of the plant by not watering. All these others need to be excluded. And the way that's done, there's lots of different ways, but people say either, Prince Charles, the Pope, was supposed to water them. It was normal for Prince Charles or the Pope to water them. It was expected of them. It was a reasonable expectation. That's all true of the gardener. it was normal for him. It was expected. It was a reasonable expectation. He ought to have done it. But you wouldn't say that about King Charles or the Pope. They have no ought about it. So that's the move that's made at that point to try and get over the profligate omission problem.
Okay. So what's wrong with that then?
Well, there's a number of problems depending on which way it's worked out. But there's a general problem in that you're introducing some kind of normative standard to causation. Right. So now that might be okay in some causations, but there's lots of causation in the world that's nothing to do with normative standards or human agency. So, the earthquake happens because the tectonic plate failed to move. The ice cap melted because the Gulf Stream failed to move, or somebody overslept because the alarm clock failed to go off. They're all things that don't seem to have any normative content at all, and yet we still have to have an explanation for why that omission should cause.
Yeah, so when you say normative content, essentially you mean there's no kind of ought or should or,
that's right,
or sort of expectation about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it does seem odd, doesn't it, to think that causation, which we think of as a kind of, I don't know, something that ought to obtain kind of independently of
human agency
or observation,
morality or normativity. It happens anyway. Why should you suddenly try and stuff in something about normativity when you're trying to explain causation? So that's a sort of general worry. And then if you look at the various ways this problem has been phrased, there are problems with all the examples. So there's it would take a while to go into in great detail, but if you talk about expected to or normal to or ought to, there are examples against them, counter-examples, which makes it unlikely that that's the full answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So just to summarise, we've got three arguments. We've got the argument that says only events can cause. We've got the argument that says causation requires push or oomph or biff or some kind of transfer of energy. And then we've got the argument from profligate ontology, which essentially says that, essentially says that you end up with some weird explanations.
That's right, yeah.
Weird results in terms of what kinds of things can have caused some given event or situation.
Everything causes.
Yeah, good, right, yeah. And you think that basically those arguments taken together give us good reason to reject the idea that omissions cause altogether, right? But still we're left with the problem that we kind of noted at the start, which is that we do tend to talk as if that's the case, right? It seems natural to say the gardener failing to water the plant caused it to die. So what's going on there? Why do we talk like that if it's
I think that's because people are confusing causation, what we've been talking about up till now, with causal explanation. And so whereas omissions can't cause, I strongly believe that, omissions can be part of a causal explanation of some event. So that's the way, and that of course gets, with a bit more theory, that can get round the profligate omission problem.
Okay, so you're going to have to explain what that distinction is then. So what's the difference between something causing another thing and something being part of the causal explanation of that?
Okay. So causal explanation is something that gives some information about the causal history of an event. So you might immediately respond, well, how can something possibly give information about the causal history without explaining what's caused it? It almost seems a nonsense. And some philosophers have criticized this idea of causal explanation on that basis. But their idea is that it's possible to give information about causal history without talking about causation. And I actually think there are three ways that can be done.
Okay, so tell me about that.
Right, so three ways. Well, the first way is by talking about an omission or an absence. Yeah. That's the problem we're trying to solve in a way. But I think that talking about an omission, a counterfactual situation where, had the plants been watered, they might have survived. Then that's giving information, but doesn't tell you anything about causation. It's different.
Right. Well, it tells you. So I suppose it tells you about. Well, it tells you what hasn't.
Yeah, what might
caused
happen in a counterfactual world.
Yeah,
but it doesn't tell you what's actually happened.
Right. Okay. But it tells you that. So in the gardener example, it tells you that there is a cause that's missing.
Yeah.
That would have prevented.
That's right. Absolutely.
The circumstances from coming.
But it doesn't tell you what caused them to die.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's one type. The other, I think, is the what's called wide disjunction. So when you're trying to explain a causal history, let's imagine somebody's in a coma. Doctors are desperately trying to work out what's caused him to be in a coma. And the doctors say to the child's parents, well, it might be meningitis, it might be septicemia, it might be a head injury, it might be a cranial bleed, all these possibilities. They're widely disjunct and they're a completely different set of causes, but they don't really tell you anything about what actually caused them. And I think philosophers feel that such wide disjunction really can't tell you anything about causation. It's just too bigger category. Okay. So that's the second group.
But it's still part of the causal explanation.
It's still part of the causal explanation, still part of the causal history, but it's not about causation. Right. And then the third group, which is a sort of linked to absences in a way, but a bit different, is for ruling out alternative hypotheses. So David Lewis, who introduced this idea of causal explanation, said the fact that the CIA man who was in the room is just a coincidence. It's not why the politician dropped dead. Right. So it's not telling you why the politician dropped dead. We have no idea why the politician dropped dead, but we do know it's nothing to do with the CIA. Okay. So and we do this all the time whenever we're sort of trying to work out about outcomes, we rule things out, and so Lewis says this is a way that a causal explanation can rule something out. It's not causation, right, but it's part of the causal history.
Right. So we've got hypotheses about what the causes of the situation are. Yeah. And what would the kind of causal explanation that's being offered is one which is ruling out one or other of those hypotheses.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's not saying what did cause the situation, but it's telling us something about what didn't.
Absolutely.
Cause it again.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So your idea is that what's happening with emissions is that the emission is part of the causal explanation. Yeah. But it's not the cause.
But not a cause. And that gets around all these worries about only events can cause and profligate emissions and things like that. Okay.
Yeah. But does it get us around the problem of profligate emissions in the sense that aren't we still left with the problem that the fact that the Pope didn't water the plant is still part of the causal explanation?
That's right.
Or could be seen as part of the causal explanation?
Yeah. So now we're saying, well, that gardener not watering the plant is part of the causal explanation, but also the Pope, King Charles, they're also part. So you might say, well, we haven't got any further. We've introduced another concept, causal explanation, but we're no further off. And there I'm going to say, well, unlike causation, which is a sort of physical in the world thing, causal explanation, it's okay to be normative. I mean, all the time we think, well, that's a good explanation, that's a bad explanation. Normativity seems to me to be built into causal explanation. Right. So the fact that the gardener not watering is part of the causal explanation of the plant dying is a very relevant, I call it salient, causal explanation. Yeah. The fact that Pope didn't water it is a daft explanation. It's no explanation at all, I would say. And therefore, we now have a way of distinguishing between the two. We have good causal explanations, and we want to accept those in a counterfactual sense. But we also have bad explanations, Pope, King Charles, and they're not helpful in any way.
So if we imagine somebody coming along and seeing the dead plant and saying, "What happened here?" And the person says, "Well, the Pope failed to
yes.
It's not that that's not true, and it's not that if the Pope. It's not that it's not the case that if the Pope had watered it, it wouldn't have happened.
It would be fine.
But bad explanation because it doesn't really tell the person anything that they want to know.
Absolutely.
Is that the thought?
Yeah. That's the thought. And although I'm just sort of starting thinking about this, I think that's got a good close link to moral responsibility, because it sort of factors in the fact that moral responsibility is very contextual, and you need to be able to tell a convincing and plausible story about what's happening. And I think causal explanation does that much better than causation.
That's interesting. Yeah. So in that scenario I just outlined, what the person's doing is asking kind of what's the causal explanation of what happened.
Yeah.
But it's kind of, if they'd been asking what's the moral explanation, or who's morally responsible, it would be an explanation along the same kind of lines.
That's right. Yeah, they're parallel
again,
to
it would
each
be
other.
pointless to say the Pope.
Yes, absolutely. He's not morally responsible. We would never want to make him morally
Yeah.
responsible for this. But he's part of the causal explanation, but a very, very, very non-salient part of that causal explanation.
Okay, so it's salience that does the job.
I
of
think
telling
so.
us
Yeah, and
what really counts as a proper causal explanation.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. And does that explain then? So to go back to the kind of previous question, does that explain why we, in your view, erroneously talk about omissions having caused situations? What we're doing is we're saying what we, not what we mean, but kind of what we ought to mean, or what we'd be correct in saying would be, the gardener not watering the plant is part of the causal explanation of why it's died, but kind of loosely we say it
That's
caused.
right. Yeah, that's right. And there has been some sort of empirical work, if you like, on this, as to social scientists, social philosophers called Livengood and Macquarie. They did some experiments and they gave students scenarios about a girl, Jane, I think her name was, climbing a rope. And they wanted to test whether the people believed that the reason the girl got to the top of the rope was caused by the rope not snapping. And there was some evidence that some people thought that, but there was also evidence that people preferred to talk about, the girl got to the top, it wasn't caused by the rope not snapping, but the girl got to the top because the rope didn't snap. So that's more of an explanatory statement than a causation statement.
Right.
And there was some evidence that people thought that way. It wasn't overwhelmingly convincing, and there were, I thought, some problems with the study that made it slightly ambiguous about when people were asked to talk about because did they know it was a causal explanation that was being tested. But there was some evidence that people got mixed up or confused, or some people did, between causation and causal explanation.
Right, but so what people were asked, just to kind of clarify, people were asked something like, Susan was climbing a rope in gym class, the rope broke.
Yeah.
What did Susan fall because the rope broke?
No,
like
that was
not,
one part of
right,
it, and that's clearly causation. I mean, the snapping of the rope caused it to fall. That was a sort of control, if you like. But the real thing they were interested in was, did the fact that the rope failed to break cause the girl to get to the top of the rope? So that was an omission, not breaking. And some people said, that caused it. But some people like to use the word because, which suggests that that's a causal explanation. It didn't cause it, but it explained why she failed or succeeded getting to the top.
Right.
Yeah.
But as you point out, that because could be ambiguous.
It could be ambiguous. It's a very difficult study if you think about it. It's really hard to test this without sort of some prior discussion about what the word cause and because means, and you're almost back to the beginning again. But with that ambiguity in mind, there was some evidence that this was the way people thought, and the sort of mistake that they made.
But actually, in a way, just the very difficulty of setting up that experiment kind of points to the fact that, the way we use language to describe these kinds of things is quite imprecise, right?
Absolutely.
And that whole point about what does because mean there?
Yeah, absolutely.
It could mean because in the sense, because could be taken to imply a cause. X happened because of Y. That means that Y caused X to happen.
Yeah.
Or does it just mean that the fact that Y happened is part of the explanation of why X happened. And there's no obvious way of kind of working out sort of what people intend when they use the word because in that kind of way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I suppose in itself is just kind of evidence that we might expect, ordinary language to be quite ambiguous on these
that's right, yeah. But I think it undermines the position of people who say, well, this idea of causal explanation can't be right. It's really just causation, because people talk all the time about, something, an omission causing something.
Yeah.
But the fact that this study showed was that there's quite a lot of ambiguity there, and what people are saying may or may not be what we think they're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, that makes perfect sense. Before we finish, I was just wondering if it'd be possible for you to say a bit about kind of what the implications of this conclusion are then for the wider project. So we started off talking about moral responsibility for harm.
Yeah.
So what are the implications of the conclusion that omissions can't cause for that point?
Yeah, I think I'm really just beginning this piece of work, but I think it puts in some conceptual space between doing harm and allowing harm. Right. Makes me think that the original intuition I mentioned earlier on has something about it that they are different concepts.
Yeah.
And when you allow harm, you're providing a causal explanation, but not causing. Now, I need to think through how morally causation and causal explanation might differ. Yeah. And how much moral is attached to causation versus causal explanation. But I think my provisional conclusion is that they are different concepts, and they may well attract different moral responsibility. But I obviously need to think a little bit more about that.
Right. So for somebody who wanted to say that omissions are kind of morally equivalent to commissions or whatever, if they could say, well, omissions still cause. So if you do something by omission, you're still causing harm. Then it becomes a bit more difficult to say that there's a moral difference.
That's right. I would say, no, they don't cause. They're part of the causal explanation. And because of that difference, there may be some difference in how we attribute moral responsibility to doings versus allowings.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Well, perhaps when you've got a bit further on with that project,
I would love to do that.
How it works out.
Thanks, Jim.
But for now, thanks, David Molyneux. Thanks very, very much for being on the podcast.
Great pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.